The following video is me attempting to decode a law that was posted and decode why people didn't tell me what part of it was so triggering for them because they decided to say it's the end of the world and a new set of laws being applied in the state of Oregon against my will. I don't think they were being honest. Let's move on. These individuals on the internet claiming to be gun rights activists said that Oregon House Bill 2005 took away my right to make a firearm if I want to. Okay. What section and what subparagraph and what page? If they don't cite where they're getting their information from, maybe it's from their orifice. It's section 1 under something labeled under 18 in parentheses. It concerns private individual possession, sale, purchase, or mere trade of a new or existing example of a specific type of item. It's narrowly defined, not broadly. Now I'm going to bring up automobiles. Automobiles, you might recognize what an automobile is. If you're not aware of it, and a lot of people aren't, there's a number that's printed onto the car when it's built by the manufacturer. That's an entity. Manufacturer means an entity that makes things not for personal use, but to resell for a profit, a financial profit in most cases. And they're involved in a process that may or may not require some regulation because they make something, but someone else has to deal with the consequences of their mistakes if it's not made well. The number on it is called a VIN, a vehicle identification number. It's usually on the dashboard area. Not always. Guns have a similar thing somewhere on the largest part in the gun, usually, not always, called the receiver, the lower receiver, the frame, or the body will be a number, and it's called a serial number. Ever since the 60s, guns have been required to have them if they're sold in the United States for the purpose of making money. Now, if someone makes a gun, they're not required to do that because they have no intent to sell it. A lot of laws in the United States are invoked or squeezed in, weaseled in many cases, based on the idea that money changes hands and someone does something and then someone else has to deal with the consequences of their handiwork. So putting a serial number on the guns became a 1960s and beyond thing. Before 1960s, lots of guns, just like at one time all cars, had no ID number except one that was applied as a license plate. The decision was made at one point or another for cars to have an ID number on it that would be based on the manufacturer's name, maybe even where it was made, out of Detroit, Michigan, let's say, and the model number, the name of the gun or the name of the car kind of concept, and having an ID number, an unambiguous, unique identifier. Now, that doesn't change the fact that the guns that existed and the cars that existed before these rules were passed didn't have the numbers and in many cases weren't required to have them. That may explain why you have license plates, because they're easier to see than a little sticker this big on the dashboard you can't see. Guns have ID numbers on them. Okay, now, let's say you want to make a gun and you don't want to go through all the steps. You might buy a partially completed gun that someone started. Well, they started it, they had the intent for it, it's a partially done gun. How far does the gun have to be completed before it has to have an ID number on it? With a car, it has to be a completed frame that could be made operational by adding additional parts. The main body of the car, the body and frame, the biggest part that everything else attaches to. It could also just be a bare frame made out of I-beams or whatever from the old days, like a Model T. That part is the part that's regulated because it's the biggest part that's less likely to change over time. In the case of a gun, it's the part that you put the trigger system in, and the hammer, and the sear, and the magazine feed parts, and screw the barrel in maybe. And it's called the frame or receiver. It's just called a receiver, legally speaking. A manufacturer, again, is someone who makes things to sell them, not use them. Someone who makes a gun who isn't planning on selling it at all, and that's not their main purpose, is a maker. As a maker of a gun, you're not required to follow laws that are applied exclusively to manufacturers. That tag on the mattress has to be applied to people who make mattresses to resell them. If you want to make a mattress of your own, you don't have to put down that stupid tag that says don't tear it off. Go look up the meme. So this law in Section 1 under something I'm going to call 18, under Oregon House Bill 2005, passed in July of 2023, applied to anything without a serial number that wasn't listed with some entity. Like the DMV registers your car, etc. This is through an FFL. Whenever they change hands, the idea is that if you're buying and selling one, you go through an entity that has the right to sell them for profit, and they charge you a small fee for recording the transaction to make it to where, you know, the insurance company's happy, or maybe your local police is happy, or maybe you just want to, like a car, make sure that you're not held responsible for the previous owner's actions with your car or your gun. Emphasis added. So anyway, so this rule only applies to anything without a serial number that hasn't had a record through an FFL. Both. It could be either. It could be serialized, but it didn't go through an FFL, right? What if it went through an FFL and didn't have a serial number? Wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. Lots of guns don't have serial numbers. Does this mean existing guns? Well, it says it applies to new and existing examples of this. But it can't apply to all guns, so what is it? It's much more narrow. What's the next layer down? Something that's only been forged, cast, extruded, machined, or otherwise partially completed firearm, frame, and receiver. If I only partially weld together the frame for a dune buggy, it's not a completed frame. It's not really a dune buggy again. You can't put the parts on and just bolt them on. It needs, the spar put on or the roll cage or something. If it's only partially finished, the law applies to it. Well, what if I finished it before July of last year? Then the law doesn't apply and you don't have to read it. But I didn't put a serial number on it. Big deal. Lots of guns before 1960 didn't have serial numbers. It's not a ghost gun unless it had a serial number and you ground it off. Yes, I know people say something different, but that's a lie. Legally speaking, ghost gun's been defined. It's not allowed to be redefined. Oregon. So let's move on. It could be a partially done firearms receiver through lots of things, but it's not able to function yet. It's a non-functional, incomplete, not completed lower receiver. That's what the rule. It only applies to that, and it doesn't have a serial number. What if you partially completed and put your own serial number on it? Then it doesn't apply. You can take the partial receiver or completed one, and you can go through the procedure. Every city has one because guns that don't have serial numbers do exist. You can ask the police, I have an old gun. It doesn't have a serial number. It's not against the law or anything. I want a serial number on it. Who do I go to get that done so I can have it listed through a federal firearms licensee? Because I was told on the internet to do that. And if they get really picky, well, it's a starter pistol. Well, you don't have to do that. Okay, sorry. If they get really weird on you, make sure it's cops that aren't being assholes. Cops want you to be in compliance with the law, not look for a reason to get a collar that week. They'll say, oh, go to this repair shop with this note we give you from the police to say, put a number on it, list it, make them legit so we can register it with the insurance company. But WAPTech, you're wrong because I need to believe whatever I read on the internet before I looked at your video. Please do so. Let's move on. Now, there are other caveats that would exclude you from having to follow these rules. Oh yeah, there are. Again, it has to be an unfinished frame or body or receiver that doesn't have a serial number and never went through an FFL. There's no record for it. And it was, here are the three criteria. One of them has to apply. It was marketed or sold to the public for the purpose of being completed, assembled, or otherwise converted to function as a finished frame or receiver. But again, if you finished it, this doesn't apply because now it's just a legit gun that was made during the period of time when you could just make one. What about the other one? Oh, it is designed to be completed and assembled or otherwise converted to function as a finished frame or receiver. Well, that's implied by the previous one, right? Yeah, but they wanted to cover their bases, so they say it 3 times, 3 different ways. And the next one, it can be completed, assembled, or otherwise converted to function as a finished frame or receiver. It's possible. But it has to be not just unfinished, it has to be partially completed by somebody else. If I made it, I'm the one partially completing it because I'm the one who did it. It hasn't transferred. The basis of this is it transferred from an entity that had no intention of completing it, but had an intention of partially completing it and making a profit selling it commercially. They're a manufacturer but they don't want to put a serial number on it. That's the basis for this. Yes, it applies to you. It's a $250,000 fine and 10-year prison sentence for the state of Oregon. Okay, fine. But it doesn't apply to you if you complete it. It doesn't apply to you if you make a legit effort to say, I need to be able to have it on my insurance because it's technically a dangerous item even if I haven't finished it yet. It's finished, but I did it May of last year, but I didn't put a serial number on it. I don't know how to do this, and I'm afraid to ask. And a police officer will say, that's very understandable. Here's how to comply with the law. A real cop. A bad cop will be like, oh, let me tell you how to do it, and they'll throw you in jail because they're assholes. You have to find out which cops aren't assholes. More accurately, criminals. Cops lying to you about the law should be declared criminals. That's my opinion. It's the most radical thing you'll ever hear from me. Okay? So, when I run into, I'm not naming the websites, all saying this applies to raw materials, a chunk of metal, that's hyperbole, that's propaganda, it's bullshit. It has to be part way completed to being a freaking gun, and recognizably, visibly a gun. It can't just be a metal block this big with a bunch of holes in it that kind of line up with the holes in an AR-15 or a Mini-14. That's not it. If I have a sheet of metal with the drawings on it to make a Cobra, which is basically a glorified miniature version of a flare gun body to put, a 45 Colt barrel on, that's not an incomplete receiver. It's a sheet of metal with a drawing on it. In spite of what the ATF would say if it would look like a machine gun or decided to call it a machine gun, it's just a sheet of metal. Sometimes a pipe is just a pipe. Don't look that up. So, Oregon House Bill 2005, without the citation to Section 1 under something labeled 18, isn't to come for your guns. It's also not to go after guns that were completed. But it can be interpreted that way. Yes, it can. But everything I'm seeing here is it came from something that was marketed or designed or can be completed, assembled, or otherwise converted to function as a finished firearm or frame or receiver that isn't finished yet. A bunch of people started stockpiling these for what-if scenarios later or to resell when they became banned and told everybody on the internet about it. A bunch of companies that didn't want to go through the federal firearms licensing rules decided to just make these things and sell them as almost totally completed firearms and thumb their nose at the government by making a almost completed gun and just making it just not complete enough to where no serial number was involved and make some political statement out of it. Or not. Some of the companies were just avoiding being sued. And honestly, some of them were avoiding an exorbitantly high fee to build these things. And very importantly, some of them were never intended to be firearms. They're fucking pellet guns and BB guns and paintball guns that are made to look like an AR-15 or an AK-47 made out of an aluminum block, which can't be an AK-40. I mean, I'd love to watch it blow up, but I don't think you want to make an AK-47 that way. The point is, a lot of these companies weren't making actual firearms. But people found out, hey, it's not totally completed. Ironically, if you started off with a completed BB gun, specific model of them, it would be easier to make it into a firearm from that. And in the state of Oregon, that's still not illegal. Even though it's a dumb idea and it's not made to spec, it might work. You can get away with it with an AR, apparently. Which is kind of sad. Anyway, the point is this a bad law? I don't really have an opinion on it. It's only covering things that haven't been finished yet. What if I want to make a gun? Does it apply to the block of metal I start off with? No. Does it apply to the partially completed one in my room? But if I made it for myself, it hasn't transferred, it can't apply. Can it? That's what people are worried about. It's for debate. But it isn't for fear-mongering. It's not about what they were saying. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. This has been a poorly interpreted set of laws that were poorly written, that left a lot of ambiguity, seemingly on purpose, and probably won't accomplish anything, and definitively, I'm sure, will be thrown out. But it's not about what the activists were saying it was about. Big surprise.